That is good news. I don't know if you've kept up with the situation over in Africa, particularly where Wilson is, there in Kenya. They've been wanting rain. And so we've talked a little bit about this. They actually just received it. And this is the first time really it's rained very much in about 2 years. And so they've lost multiple crops. And so anyway, something that I talked to him this morning and he was very thankful about. And so it's something we can definitely be appreciative of as well. Now the other thing is just in preparation for this text. When we come to a text like this is a familiar story. This is part of the well-trodden section of our Bibles. But I don't want us to underemphasize the significance of this text. There's a lot of times when you come through and you try to prepare a lesson or teach a lesson, okay, you need to be serious about it, you need to prepare, you need to focus. This is one of those sections where this is the difference not just between life and death, this is the difference between eternal life and eternal death. And that's what this text emphasizes. You see it in verse 51. You see it as well with the unfaithful slave down there in verse 30, and especially down there in 46 and the end of this text. This is a serious text, and it's because it is discussing one of the most important things. It is the second coming of the Lord. If you remember here in Matthew 24, Jesus had these condemning words for the scribes and Pharisees. He predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And the disciples asked him this question back in verse 3. Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, I mentioned last week that in the minds of the disciples, these likely went together. For example, if you looked at these events in Zechariah 12 through 14, one of the places he talks about these, he has a phrase. It is in that day, in that day, in that day. And as you go through that entire text, you might be asking, well, when? And that's the question that they're asking. When is all this going to happen? When is the things like the pouring out of the Spirit that causes the house of David and the people of Jerusalem to mourn, and that opening of the fountain for sin and impurity, the striking of the shepherd and being scattered, the destruction of Jerusalem, the gathering of the nations? If you look through that text, it all kind of basically has that same phrase, in that day. And it would be natural to go through and say this is all going to happen at the same time, or at least within a short period of time. But I believe one of the fundamental parts of this section is he's helping the disciples to understand the expanded time period within the prophecies themselves. How they should understand those prophecies and how they should live in the future. And this is especially important because right after we go into this section, what do we have? We have the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. We have the ascension. We have all of these various pieces. And this is the beginning. This is where things are going to change. A new opening that has never happened in human history is about to happen. And so how do you explain that to people that have never seen it before? They just know what's been said about that time, and now he's trying to explain that to them. But the reason that this is important is because think about the things that we struggle with. Do you ever have trouble understanding prophecy? Like what God was talking about, what he meant? There's a lot of times we have that trouble as well. And then also, if you ever wonder, well, what does that mean for me? How am I supposed to live in light of what he's prophesying, in light of what he's talking about? Well, that's the kind of things that they needed right there, and that's what this text provides for us as well. And so with that being said, we're going to talk about this second question. You might say there's three, but I'm kind of lumping these two together here. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So let's talk about this first question, or let's talk about this concept of the end of the age for just a minute. So Jesus has been talking about this already. If you remember back in Matthew chapter 13 with the parable of the kingdom, the various 7 parables that he gave there were 2 that were very important. It was the wheat and the tares, and also the parable of the dragnet. And he said in both of those cases basically the same kind of thing. There's going to be a great gathering of all of the plants, or gathering of all of the bottles and that kind of thing. And then there's going to be a judgment. Some are going to be rewarded. Some are going to be punished, but all of that happens at the end of the age. And it would be an ultimate and permanent division. And he even alluded to this as well in Matthew 16 and verse 27, when he said that the Son of Man is going to come in glory with his angels and render to every man according to their deeds. He's been talking about these kind of things throughout the gospel so far. But the fundamental question is just like with the disciples. Okay, Jesus, we believe you. Okay, we believe that you're going to come. We believe that these things are going to happen. When? And is there going to be a sign before these things happen? And so as we saw last week regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, yes, there were clear signs that you would be able to tell that was about to happen. But as it relates to his second coming, he said that no one knows but the Father, or at least that's principally. Perhaps he's talking as well about the destruction of Jerusalem. But no one knows, there's no signs. So then, what is the purpose then? What has Jesus been trying to do here in this section? Well, he's been talking about a section, again, trying to understand these prophecies regarding his second coming. And there's a pattern here within these parables. And we'll see it connects with this text here. Notice in all three of these parables, in 45, verses 45 through 51, and so on with the virgins and also with the servants there, all of them have a very similar pattern. All of them have a leader of some sort. You have like a master of a house. You have a bridegroom of some sort, or some kind of, again, a master and his estates. And there's a lot of common themes that are all the way through this entire text. But one thing that is especially important is that the leader is noticeably absent. Did you notice that? In every single one of the stories, the leader is absent, and there's an intermittent period where he was there, he's not there for an undefined period, and then now he comes back suddenly. And so, for example, the master is away in the first, and he comes on a day whenever the man does not expect him. The bridegroom, he's delaying for some reason, and then he appears. And then the man on the journey, he goes on a long journey. Now, why is Jesus doing all of that? Well, go back to this text in Matthew 22 for just a second. In Matthew chapter 22, remember the text Jesus mentioned to the religious leaders, and we've emphasized this text in our Hebrews class, and we also emphasized it when we were here. In Matthew 22, this time in verse 44, he asked them, what do you think about the Christ? And he quotes Psalm 110 and verse 1. He said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies beneath your feet. What we've talked about in that text, and it is important for this, is there was a sitting down moment and a ruling and reigning until a period where all enemies are put under his feet. So there's clearly an initial event, and there's clearly an ultimate event, and there's this kind of prolonged absence or this prolonged reigning until. And so that's what he's describing in these stories for them. And they see this. This would be normal illustrations, but it's to help them understand what's about to happen. Their Lord is with them right now. He's about to be gone, and they are anticipating his coming back. But he's also describing to the disciples something that's important about prophecy. See, prophecy should be read like looking at a mountain range. If you've ever been to a series of mountains, you probably know what I'm talking about. You can look and see an enormous distance, and maybe there's one really great peak out there. And then there's other various peaks there. And when you look, you think, wow, they're all one thing. They're all right there together. But if you look at it with a little bit closer inspection, you realize there's actually a great distance sometimes between those various peaks. And so when the prophets are saying about that day, they're looking at all of the mountain range. But what Jesus is helping them to do is to understand the distance in between some of those events. And so he's helping them to understand, like in Matthew 24, going back there, that there are some things that are the beginning. The destruction of Jerusalem is one of those things. And yet he goes on to say multiple times that that is not the end. And so this is an important concept. This is a convoluted chart, so I don't expect you to know every single thing here. If you want to look at it later, you can. But here's the point. We have creation, and here's the death of Christ, and you have the temporal age that is going on. But with him coming and bringing the resurrection, now you have an eternal age that has begun, and it just goes on until this moment. when the Lord returns, and then you have the eternal state. And this is the point here. He must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. That's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15, and he's quoting from Psalm 110. So again, how do you describe all of this, though? How do you describe the transition and this overlap? Well, again, to people that really are seeing it all at one time, it's hard. But now he's trying to tease out the details there. And so this makes sense of the entire passage then. Because look at what he says here in 25 and verse 1. In 25 and verse 1, he says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins." What is he saying? He's saying this is the kingdom of heaven presently, how you behave while the kingdom is there. But then notice how he describes it as well here in verse 34. He says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'" So what is it? Are we in the kingdom or are we not in the kingdom? See, that's the point. You're in it. This is how the kingdom is, and yet there is a full inheritance of this that is there in the future. And so this is helping them to answer really the questions they asked about the sign and about his coming and about the end of the age. How do you describe that? Well, it's kind of complicated, but let me give you some stories to help you understand that. And that's what these are. But again, it helps them not just in an intellectual way. It helps them to know how to live. He didn't just tell them, say, hey, here's your information and here's your facts. It's to say these people were living the right way or these people were living the wrong way. And he's preparing them for that. And so it helps us, again, to understand prophecy and then how to live today. So let's talk about these parables here. And I want us to understand, again, the basic flow. We've basically seen that. But on the surface, a lot of these things are relatively basic. These are stories that you can get we could read this to our children and say, well, what was the point of the faithful stewards? Or what was the point about the talent? Or what was the point about the virgins? And we would come across with very simple things, very basic concepts, again, trying to explain this. And the other thing is, as we come to these texts, how many of y'all have read these stories before? Everybody's read these stories before, right? So when you look at these are things that are pretty easy to understand, especially in light of what we're talking about, and you're familiar with them. But I think the question is, what do these things actually look like? What does it look like to be a faithful steward? What does it look like to be one of the 10 virgins? What does it look like to be this man that has the money and to use it the right way? And that's what I really want us to focus on, and I think we'll kind of get the overall flow of that. And so with that being said, let's talk about this first one here. If you're with us at 24, verse 45 down through verse 51, what is the one thing that he's talking about here? He's talking about faithfulness. He's talking about faithfulness. This parable is about leadership and relationships in the household of Jesus while he is away. Just like in the first century, you would have a man that had a house, had an estate, and all of that idea. It actually is much like the story of Joseph. If you remember the Joseph and Potiphar situation. Potiphar just put everything in charge of Joseph, and he was expected to be faithful with that. And so on one hand, you have a servant who cares for the house and provides the food. On the other hand, you have an evil servant, someone that's not faithful, and he goes through and beats his fellow slaves and indulges in the food that was meant to be for their provision. And so he goes on to say that the evil man was cut in pieces and assigned a place with the hypocrites in hell, as we understand it. And the other is blessed, and because of that, he is now in charge of all the master's possessions. Maybe there was a specific responsibility here with the food, but now it expands. Now, what is he talking about? Well, what is the household of God today? Byron, what's the household of God today? It's the church, right? And we've been in 1 Timothy, and what does he say that entire letter is about? How to conduct yourself in the household of God and the people that are serving in that. So I'm not going to go through the entire book of 1 Timothy. I encourage you to come to the class on that. But, so on one hand, this applies to the leaders that are in the church, Timothy, the elders, and so on. But as well as he's emphasized through that study, it's for all disciples because you're part of this house. You're part of the North Hixson household, the family that belongs to Jesus. And so it's important to understand our identity. We're part of a family. This isn't just a place that you come to. It's not just a building. It's a family. It's a house that you belong to that belongs to Jesus. Now, notice though, why did this wicked man act like this? If you look at what he says here in verse 48, he said in his heart, "My master is not coming for a long time." See, what happened is this man took his mind off of the end. He started focusing on himself. He saw the food, at least part of that. He's enjoying the drink, and he's thinking, hey, I can get away with some things while the master's not there. And yet, the master did come and held him accountable and ultimately judged him. It's interesting the place he was put as well. He is there put with the hypocrites. Now, we've already read Matthew 23, but a hypocrite is someone that wears a mask. This is a person that looked like a servant on face value. He looked like he was actually a servant of the master, and yet he was a fraud. And so he now is assigned a place with the rest of the frauds outside. So what does this look like then? What does it look like to be faithful in God's house? Well, I'm not going to teach everything that Byron is teaching, but I think a good summary text is Colossians chapter 3. And it's interesting to see all of the texts that we're going to go to, with the exception of the last one, at least these two points here, notice how Paul makes direct allusions to the Lord coming back and how that changes the behavior and it makes a difference. And so in chapter 3 here, I want us to read verse 1 down through verse 14. It says, "Therefore, if you have been raised with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ." Now notice verse 4. "When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. And in them you also once walked when you were living in them. But now you also put them all aside: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free man, but Christ is all and in all. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." Now, the reason I went to this text is because it breaks down into some very simple categories and gives us some practical things here. When you look at verses 1 through 4, just look at the questions. Look at the things that would naturally come out of this. As we think about ourselves and being faithful here, are we seeking the things that are above? Are we setting our mind on things that are above and not on things on the earth? Do you view your life, when you look at it, as something that is dead and is hidden with Christ, and you are waiting for him to come back and to reveal who you are and to reveal your life so that you can be with him? Your life, as the way he's describing it, is tied up in Jesus, and he's going to reveal it. He's going to give it to you. When that is so rooted and grounded, notice the things that he says in verse 5 that are naturally going to be put to death: immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and so on. See, what he's saying is the reason we, in a sense, beat the slaves and indulge in the food and the drink over there in Matthew 24 is because we've taken our eyes off the Lord. We're not really interested in what he has to bring with him, And we're not concerned of what he thinks of. We're interested in ourselves. And inevitably, that's where all of this goes. We start beating the servants, don't we? We start doing the things he describes there in verse 8, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech. It doesn't take very long. Anybody that's been in a church, in the household of God for very long, knows that people, Christians, behave like this sometimes. And why is it? It's because they've taken their minds and their eyes off the Master. And so the point is, we think we're kind of playing this game that he either A, doesn't know, or B, I can kind of just keep doing this, and he's not going to hold me accountable. And yet the point of this parable is absolutely he will, and he will come at a time when you're not expecting him. The Lord could come back, or you could die. And you're in that state, and it's a permanent state. Now, on the other hand, look at what he says in verse 12. He says that we are those who have been chosen of God. What's he saying? He's saying you're in the community. You're in the household of God. You're part of this new and redeemed community of Jesus, chosen of God, and yet there are expectations then. If we want to know what it looks like to be faithful and to treat the household well, look at what he says. Do you have a heart of compassion? Are you kind and humble and gentle and patient? Do you bear with other people in the household? Do you forgive one another? See, love is the thing that binds all of this together, and it's rooted in the fact we've been forgiven. What does it look like to be faithful today in his household? That's what it looks like. It looks like people that are repentant. It looks like people that are loving and caring for one another. And I'll tell you, you want to know why people behave like this? It's again right there in verse 13 when he says, just as the Lord forgave you, so also you should do. They have their minds on Jesus. Their heart is set in him. He has their life. And their mind is not set on the things of the world. See, people behave like this when they are treasuring him. And they treasure his people. And so that's the question then. Is that you? Is that me? Because this is our work. You know what? And this is one of the things that's so interesting about this text. You know what God really wants you to do? It's really simple. Love people. Treat them well. Take care of them. Be generous with. It's not complicated. That's what 1 Timothy is. And yet, oftentimes, we just find ourselves in the situation of, I want to eat, I want to drink, and I end up beating my fellow slave. Let's keep going. Go back to Matthew 24. Back in Matthew 24, or in 25 now, in verse 1. He had the parable of the virgins. So the next one pictures the great wedding to come. And so virgins were tasked with waiting for the bridegroom to come, and they would carry these large lamps as part of a procession. So it's not the small things, but it's a procession for the bridegroom. And they would eventually go with him and lead that until they came to the wedding location. Now, it was common, though, for the bridegroom to arrive at an unexpected time. Just think about how this works. You may have got hung up with the camels, right? You got hung up with the gifts or whatever, and you don't have a phone, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have internet, you don't have email and texting and instant news. How are you going to let them know about that delay? It's just, and this happened from time to time, and from what I understand, it could even become somewhat of a game behind it. But regardless, there's something important here. In verse 3, you have some people that are taking their responsibility seriously, or some that aren't, and some that are. You have people that understand the responsibility of the lamps, but they don't take any oil with them. They're not accounting for any delay. They're not accounting for any of these potential problems, and they're not preparing. And yet you have others that are saying, okay, I'm going to bring some oil in flasks along with their lamps. So they're taking their responsibility seriously. So ultimately, he comes back. They're obviously caught unprepared, and they miss the opportunity. Now, what does this mean then? This is you and me. This is you and me. Put yourself again back in the story here, and we're tasked with being ready for a great wedding that is about to come. If you read Revelation 21 and verse 2, that's the picture. There is a wedding in the future, and it's not just for life. It is the ultimate and eternal marriage of Christ and the church. It's one thing to miss a wedding. I missed a wedding of a good friend of mine, and I felt bad about it. And what was it? Part of it's lack of preparation, and we felt awful about it. Put yourself in this situation. You're responsible in someone's wedding, and you missed it. Ever been there? Now imagine missing the ultimate wedding, the eternal wedding. There's not going to be another one. It's that wedding. The whole point is we're expected to be ready when the bridegroom returns. Now notice again, readiness is the issue here. So these people, to some extent, they had their lamps, but they hadn't done all the preparation that was necessary. And yet, look at what he goes on to say. And this, I think, is the most stark point in this text. Verse 12. Truly I say to you, I do not know you. See, the reason that they were not allowed to come in is because they had not done the preparation, and the ones that had done the preparation knew it. They had the relationship with him, and their preparation apparently is tied to their knowledge and care for the bridegroom. Now, pair that again with another concept. Go to Philippians chapter 3. Let me give you an example of someone that understood this, and he was serious about his preparation. In Philippians chapter 3, I want us to look at verses 7 down through verse 21 here. So Paul has this goal in his life of preparing. And he says here in verse 7, but whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ. More than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things and count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Christ, and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith. Verse 10, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, in that I may attain to the resurrection of the dead. What is he interested in? He wants to know Jesus, and his entire life has been shaped by that. In fact, he is pressing forward, he says down there in verse 14. That's his goal. That's his purpose, is to know him intimately. And what is he looking for? He goes on later, down here in verses 17 through 21, to talk about the contrast. You have some people that are enemies of the cross of Christ. They don't want to bear the removal of the works of the flesh. They don't want to pursue the things of God. Their minds are set, he says, on earthly things. Their glory is their shame. Their God is their appetite. And as a result, in verse 19, their end is destruction. You have people that are consumed with the things of this world. They're going to be destroyed. But look at what he's focused on. Verse 20. For our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory, by the exertion of the power that he has, even to subject all things to himself. When you look at this text, does this look like someone who is focused on preparing for the wedding? There's not another resurrection. Do you understand that? There's not another time your body is going to be changed. There's not another opportunity beyond this. Just like he described in the parable, the door is shut. You're either ready to go in when the bridegroom is ready, or you will be left outside. And what is the determining factor behind all of this? It is a knowledge of him. It's trying to know him, trying to be more like him. And brethren, here's the point that I think we need to understand. Whose time do you have right now? In a sense, you have your own time. But it's also given to you, isn't it? You are given time. You are given information. You're given the things that you need to be ready for the wedding and to celebrate for him and celebrate with him. But how are you using the time? Are you prepared? Just think about a few simple questions here. How much of this book do you really know? Is it just this part? Do you know all of this? This is the part that helps you to know him, to be prepared. How much of your life then is about putting on the attributes of the new man, putting to death the old and putting on the good works, the things we talked about there in Colossians? Just think about everything he's describing. Is that what you're straining toward, you're pressing forward to? If you're not pressing forward to and you're not ready, and you're not preparing for that day, the truth is you don't know him. You don't know who he is, and you don't understand what's happening in the future. And so we have to strive to know him and to strive to be ready. But let's go back over here to Matthew 24, or to chapter 25 now. So we've got faithfulness, we've got readiness, but then we also have resourcefulness. And I think of all the ones here, this is probably the one that is the most common. I've even preached on this text since I've been here. But this last one is about talents. And in a sense, I like the bag of money translation that the NIV does. Because when we hear talents, we think, hey, what I can do, right? But it's about money. It was a physical asset that he was giving there. But it focuses here, this story is about the resourcefulness of the servants. And so a talent, we kind of look at that and we're like, well, as I already mentioned, we kind of get confused, but we also don't appreciate how much money this was. I went through, there's a website called vcalc.com, and they've got more in that title, but they estimated the worth of a talent of gold, a measurement, in today's money. You know how much that is? According to them, it was $1,938,888. That's some cash. Imagine someone dropped $2 million in your bank account and said, hey, take care of it. Further, think about the one that has 5. He has nearly $10 million. The one next to him has $4 million. And even the last one, of course, it's according to ability, but still, he has $2 million. He's got some assets. He's got some time. He's got some resources given to him. He can't go through and say, well, I don't have the money to do that. You got the money. You got the time. I'm putting this in your care. Now, again, it's according to ability, but look at what the intention was. We can see what the intention of the master was by what he said. The intention is to share that, to increase the estate. That's what pleased the master. And the goal of what he said to them is for them to be good and faithful and to enter into the happiness of the master. Do you think he was just saying, hey, just take care of this and then you don't get anything out of it? Like, no, you're going to share in this. That's the whole point. Enter into the joy of your master. So 2 are very industrious with their resources and they increase it. But 1, he does nothing with it and he gives it back to the man. And he went and spent his time. I kind of wonder with this story, what was he doing? What did he do? It was a long time, the text says. What was this man doing during all this time? I don't know what he was doing. Apparently it was something else. And then obviously he gives it back to the man and he is furious about it. He had despised the opportunity provided by the man. Now notice verse 29. It was a test, wasn't it? Jesus makes the point, here's the conclusion we should take. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. What's the goal? If you use it, you get more. If you don't use it, it's taken away from you. And how true is that not only with physical blessings, but even about our lives? We waste those things. We don't use them for his glory. What happens? Taken away. And so it's a question then of what do we do with the resources and opportunities that are in front of us? Well, think about this text in Romans chapter 12. In Romans chapter 12. I want to pair this with a concept, again, that's familiar to us. But in Romans 12 here, verses 1 down through verse 13, he starts out with saying, here's the mercies of God. Present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship, or your reasonable service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Does that sound like Be a good and faithful servant and enter into the joy of your master. Like, prove that the way that I'm living my life, the way I want you to live your life, is the right way to do that. Offer your life back to me. I've given you so much. Offer it back and just show that this is the right way to live. But then he goes on in verse 3 and he says, "For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment. For God has allotted to each a measure of faith. For just as we have many members in one body, and all the members do not have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly." You see what his point is? We've been given something, and it's more than just a physical asset or some money. It is a measure of faith, and it's for the diverse benefit of the body. And all of us have these gifts that differ again according to ability, and what does he encourage us to do? Use them. It's an enormous wealth. And he's not just talking, obviously, about physical assets. Oftentimes, the things that are so valuable about a person are not their bottom line. They're much more valuable. And here's the things that he wants us to do. Things like prophecy and according to faith. Verse 7, serving, teaching, exhorting one another, being a leader, showing mercy with cheerfulness. And he goes on to describe all sorts of different things that are part of this process. And so you're pursuing love, abhorring evil, doing what's good, caring for other people. That's what we're made to do. That's what we were made to do in the beginning, and that's what God is trying to do in us now. And it's a beautiful description of a community that is really understood. I have something to offer, and I can benefit the community. But the question then is, what are we doing with our gifts? Sadly, many of us operate like the one-talent man. We say, I can't do that. I don't have anything to offer. I'm not smart enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not talented enough. We just lay out the entire things. And yet, the truth is, even though we may not have as much as other people, ultimately our value is kind of like that $2 million. You can do a lot. You may not do as much as the 5, but you can do a lot. And yet we look at our various gifts and the wealth we have, and we despise it. Maybe we don't think we have enough. Maybe we don't think our gifts are very special. Or maybe, like this text is talking about, we're just interested in other things. I can use my talent, but I'll use my talent for my job. I can use my talent, but I'm going to use it for my family. There's a lot of those kinds of things. But the truth is, brethren, we've been trusted with tremendous resources, and it may not be financial, but let me just say one thing. You're in the top 1% of the world. If anybody at any time in human history could say, we have the resources, it has to be this culture. But on the other side, even if you look at your bank account and say, I don't have that much, do you realize there are people that talk about capital, and they say there's 8 forms of capital. There's intellectual, financial, natural, cultural, built, political, individual, social. And what he's describing is there's a lot of things that have a lot of value and are really important that aren't money. And you got it. The point that this text is saying in Romans 12 is none of us is too poor or too insignificant to offer something to the body. As Paul says, having gifts, you already have it. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. And yet, what do we do a lot of times? We spend them on ourselves. We spend them on our retirement. We spend them on video games. We spend them on entertainment. And look, I'm not saying you can't do any of those kind of things, but where are we putting our assets? How are we using the things? Now, with all that being said, it leads to this last section now. This last section in Matthew 25, the final judgment. The blessings on the righteous and the curses on the wicked. And I like this because Jesus really blends together all of these parables and brings them to a full culmination. He gives us insight into what does it look like in real life for a person who is faithful, ready, and resourceful. What does Jesus want us to do while He is gone? And He gives us a flash forward to the future when He comes in glory and He holds all men accountable. You'll notice there wasn't, the group in Chattanooga wasn't there. Everybody was there. All nations are in front of Him, and He's making that final separation. And what is the criteria here? It's how they treated the least of Jesus' brethren. Is that shocking to you? To me, I would think that's shocking. I had this kind of discussion a little bit with Byron when you look at this. See, a lot of us, we would think it was what they doctrinally believed, right? And yet the whole point is, why do we have sound doctrine? Is it to believe the right things? Or is it so that we believe the right things so we do the right things? He judges them according to their works, their behavior, the way they actually operated in normal daily life. See, I can imagine it shocked them. It shocks me that that's the criteria. That's what I'm going to be judged on, what I did with other people. And yet, isn't that the culmination of this section? What did Jesus want from the household? He wanted them to treat each other well. What did He want from the virgins? He wanted them to know Him, to have a relationship with Him. He wanted them to be ready. What did He want them to do with those resources? To serve. Go and use those. Now, what does that look like? Here's what it looks like. It looks like people who go to His family that are hungry, thirsty, strangers, naked, sick, and in prison, and care for their needs. And in contrast, it's interesting to see the reason these people are condemned. Do you know why they're condemned? It's because they're focused on themselves. They don't care about other people. They don't know the bridegroom. They don't understand who Jesus is and what His whole life was about. And they wasted those resources and abilities that God had given them. See, what has Jesus said the kingdom is about? You remember back there in Matthew 20, verse 28? He said something about what the kingdom of heaven was about. He said here, as He's describing the kingdom to His disciples, He says, verse 25, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for many." That's who He is. That's what the kingdom is all about. And whenever we are not serving, we're missing that. So it's caring for people. It's caring for those that are in the world, obviously. But I think the principle of Galatians 6 and verse 10 is here. As you have opportunity, do good to all, especially those of the household of faith. But hell is a prepared place for people that are consumed with pride and selfishness. They don't know the Lord, and they hate what He stands for because they don't care for other people. And so here's the truth that I want us to take away with. We're almost done here. In verse 40 and verse 45, here's the criteria. He said, "Truly I say to you, as you did it or did not do it, to the least of these, you did it or you did not do it to me." Jesus radically identifies with His brethren. More than just saying, "Hey, you hurt my family." You see what He said? He said it was me. Now that becomes a double-edged sword, doesn't it? Because think about it. On the good side, if you're doing good to a person, who are you doing that to? You're doing it to Jesus. Ever thankful for the gospel and becoming a Christian and all of that kind of thing? Here's how you express your thankfulness to Him. But on the other side, if we do evil, who are we doing evil to? To Jesus. See, on one side, it radically empowers service. You're serving Jesus. So when you look at a poor Christian, you don't say, "Man, that's a pretty terrible person right there. I don't want to help them." Say, no, that's Jesus. And I'm going to help him. But on the other side, this condemnation shows that these are about how we treat Jesus. And the evil actions here are not even things that are direct and overt, like beating Jesus. You notice? This is just acts of omission. It's that you had food, you had clothes, you had time, you had all of those kind of things, and you didn't use it in that way. So how do I live like that? Because I don't want anybody to end up in that particular camp. How do we get to living the way that he describes here? Well, the reason Jesus wants us to do these things is, think about the description there of people that were hungry, thirsty, strangers, naked, sick, and in prison. Does that describe anybody? I hope you realize before Jesus came into your life, that described you. And that described me. See, the reason Jesus wants us to do these things to the least of the brethren is because we were the least, and he did it to us. And that's a person that understands the gospel. In fact, the way John says it here, he says, "In this is the love of God revealed, that he gave his Son for us." And do you know what he goes on to say? "Therefore, brethren, we ought to love one another." That's why the distinction here is so glaring. Here are people who thought they were disciples, but they're condemned. Why? Because they mistreated people? Yeah. But why are they mistreating them? It's because they don't know God. They don't know the gospel. But if we want to live like this, then we have to understand what the gospel is. And more than just kind of out there in the wide open, we've got to make it personal and understand this is what the kingdom of heaven is about. That's what Matthew 20 and verse 28 is all about. He gave his life as a ransom for many, and so I do the same thing for other people. And so, brethren, this is how we show ourselves today. If you want to know how you can be ready for that day, here it is. Just read this. Go out and love people. Care for them. Don't hold on to your wealth. Don't be proud. And when the Master comes, we will be ready. And he will commend us as good and faithful servants. We can enter into his joy. We can inherit the kingdom, prepare for us from the foundation of the world. And so now we have the opportunity then to come to the cross, to remember what has been done for us in that enormous way. And I know as well, perhaps this is something for you, you think, I need to get right. And so I know this is a little out of order. Do you have an invitation song you could lead for us? We're going to offer an invitation as well. Because there might be someone that's saying, I want to be right before that day. And we'd be glad to help them as well. What's the song, Austin? Okay, let's sing number 814 as we stand and as we sing.